the labor theory of value. The labor theory of value. And the labor theory of value is fairly simple, although it has been worked out in other complexities. Now, the labor theory of value is a lot of times associated with Karl Marx. And that makes sense because the labor theory of value was the foundation, the economic foundation of his economics and his worldview philosophy. Okay, so that's where he started and what he assumed. Now, it's also associated with Karl Marx because even though he was not the only one who assumed the labor theory of value, he's the one who tried to give an empirical framework for the labor theory of value. He basically tried to work out the ideas of his theory by saying, okay, how do we determine the value of a commodity? And he basically said you can do it by seeing what is something that they all share in common. And his conclusion was what all commodities share in common is the human labor that went into to produce them. And then from that point, you can have an objective value placed on commodities or goods and services. Now, other people, even though Karl Marx is associated with communism and other things, other people who were kind of more associated with free market economics, they assumed the labor theory of value too. For example, back in 1776, there's a famous economic book, very important economic book written called Wealth of Nations, written by this guy, this Scottish economist, Adam Smith. Adam Smith is associated more with what we might call free market economics. Okay, so he's not a communist, but he too assumed that the value of commodities could come from, ultimately come from the labor that was in them, that could be objective, meaning that you could actually place an objective value on these things. Okay. Now, Marx, Smith and others just kind of assumed the labor theory of value. Marx tried to actually give it an empirical framework. So we have to hand it to Marx actually here, because he did attempt at least to walk through the theory and actually show why he believed it was true. Okay. Now, Marx does so in a way, though, that was logically self-defeating. Okay, so he engaged in what's called circular reasoning or question begging, which makes an argument logically invalid. Okay, and we'll show kind of why that was the case. Because so he basically reasoned in a circle and assumed what he was trying to prove, and logically he can't do that. And he also left out some important factors as well. But his reasoning and his methodology, his way of going about it, kind of made some sense. All right. So let me explain kind of what the labor theory of value is, and I'll show you guys this screen as well. This is just a kind of online economics encyclopedia, basically, that has entries about these different topics. Okay. And this one is talking about Marxism and the core of his labor theory of value. Okay. So he writes about it in his book, Capital, 1867, right? And he writes other books on it that were published after he was dead. Adam Smith follows the labor theory of value somewhat as does this lesser known guy, but David Ricardo, who also writes a book, Principles of Economics, that people of kind of free market economics have read for over 100 years. Okay, so it's not just a Marxist idea. However, I think the labor theory of value is untrue, right? But we're going to try to explain it accurately and see that the labor theory of value has some surface validity. It seems to make some sense. But basically, here it is. It's a fairly simple idea. It's that the value of a commodity, okay, which a commodity is just anything. It could be shoes, could be a loaf of bread, could be yarn, could be a cell phone, okay? The value of a commodity can be objectively measured by the average number of labor hours required to produce that commodity. Okay, the value of a commodity can be objectively measured by the average number of labor hours to produce that commodity. Now, just to put a few caveats here, Marx and others were not believing that the value that went into something could just be that the labor that went into something could create value no matter what. So like if somebody took a sledgehammer and went out and was hitting the dirt for 5 hours and they worked really hard, he's not saying that that's going to create something valuable. He believed in what he called socially necessary labor. So which I have issue with because that's a value judgment already in and of itself. I mean, how do you judge what's socially necessary? You know, someone painting a painting versus making shoes. But he says that these items have to have some sort of utility to them. They have to be socially useful, right? So like shoes or something like that are socially useful, or bread or yarn or whatever the case may be. And that how you measure what something is worth is that you look at the labor that went in to produce it. Okay, that kind of makes some sense. And so in his calculation, if a pair of shoes takes twice as long to produce as a pair of pants, then the value of the shoes is twice as valuable as the pair of pants. Now, if you think about that, that kind of makes some sense. However, if you think about it a little bit harder, that's not necessarily true, because there's the input cost, there's whether it's socially necessary, there's whether or not people actually want it, there's what they want at the time. Now, I'm sure, they were aware of all those things. However, there are other factors there at work. And he also believed that, like, the skill of a doctor versus the skill of someone who was making shoes, while they're both working, that the skill of the doctor is just a multiple of the skill of someone making shoes. So that you would just kind of multiply the labor used to make shoes times a certain amount, and that would equal the labor of a doctor performing surgery. Okay, so there's trying to quantify labor based on its value. Okay, he also show you another quote, actually from Marx himself, where he said that if he quoted actually Aristotle and said there can be no exchange without equality, and no equality without commensurability. So what he's using this quote from Aristotle to say is that people would not trade unless they believed that the goods they were trading, the commodities they were trading, were equal. Okay, so if someone bakes a loaf of bread and a cobbler makes shoes, and they trade, the labor that went into those things and the view of those goods must be that they are in fact equal. Okay, so we'll come back to that. But that's his presupposition, that he's assuming that if people trade things, it's because they believe that their value is equal, and they must be equal because in his mind, they are the same amount of labor went to produce them. Okay. Another quote here from Marx is that he says, if we disregard the value, the use value of commodities, only one property remains, that being the products of labor. So what Marx did actually was kind of a smart and interesting methodology, although I don't think he followed his methodology consistently. I'll explain why in a minute. But he argued basically this: if you take a shoe and you look at basically, you eliminate everything else in a commodity, the only thing that remains of where the commodity gets its value is its labor. Okay, so Marx basically says all that we're left with is that human labor determines the value of a commodity. Here's the problem. Here's the flaw with Marx's argumentation there, is that he makes this argument where he says, okay, the only commonality between goods that are different from each other, for example, a shirt is different than a loaf of bread, which is different than a cell phone. He says there are all those things that are different between them. The only thing that is the same is human labor. And so he basically says, okay, that's the final factor. That's the only factor by which we can judge value, is the same thing that makes them all common. And therefore, if people trade them, it's because they're equal, and then an equal number of hours went into producing those items. If people trade them, because they're equal items. Okay, here's a problem. Okay, problem number one with that argumentation is while it is true that a shirt and a loaf of bread are different from one another, they have differences of things that they do and things that they're for, the common things between them are not necessarily just human labor. One of the things common between bread and shoes are that they are useful to people. But Marx says he wants to disregard use value of commodities. But that was what he said at the beginning was necessary to make a commodity valuable. He said that you have to have human labor that is socially useful, that has utility, meaning it has to be used for something. But now he says we're going to disregard the use value of commodities, and he says the only thing that we're left with, the only thing that is common between commodities, is that they're products of human labor. Okay, so he arbitrarily says, don't look at these other things that are common between products. Instead, just look at human labor. So he assumes the conclusion that he wants to prove, and you can't logically do that. Another problem, got a quote from Marx down here. Another problem is that not all items have value because of human labor. For example, if you go out into nature, there are some items that will be valuable independent of any human labor. For example, a farmer may want a tract of land. The land is not necessarily valuable because a bunch of people have worked on it. In fact, the less people that may have used the land, the better for that farmer. And so or you think of like oil in the ground, or if you stumbled upon like a diamond that you just found somewhere, or water. These things are not valuable because of human labor. They're valuable because people want them. They have some use. So this is one of the biggest problems with the core fundamental idea of the labor theory of value is that it assumes that what is common in all commodities is human labor, and that's what gives it its value. But it's not true. There are lots of things that uh, have value that don't involve human labor. And so human labor cannot be the commonality. Marx even says a thing can be a thing can be a use value without being a value. Okay, he goes, this is the case whenever its utility to man is not mediated through labor. He says air, virgin soil, natural meadows, unplanted forests, etc., fall into this category. So Marx himself even admitted that there are things that can have value without being connected to labor, which is detrimental, I think, to his whole theory, and to the labor theory of value in general. I shouldn't really say his theory; it's part of his theory, but it's the core of Marx's economic and philosophical reasoning. It's this labor theory of value. Uh, in addition, another thing to think about as we look here is that he was basing his assumptions on that people trade commodities because they believe them to be equal. But I think that the opposite is true. I think people trade commodities precisely because they're unequal. Okay, think of somebody who has a shirt and wants a loaf of bread, and then somebody who has a loaf of bread and wants a shirt. The shirt and the loaf of bread serve different purposes. We get that. They have human labor that created them. Okay, that's true. They have use value. You know, somebody's going to use it, so it's socially necessary. All that may be true. However, if they are totally equal, why would the two ever trade? If those items are totally objectively equal in the eyes of those who hold them, and they serve exactly the same purposes by virtue of being equal, who would ever trade anything? Okay, you see what I'm saying here? The reason why people trade is because they want what the other person has more than they want what they have. And they're willing to give up what they have in order to get what the other person has. So they believe that giving up X they are getting something that is X plus one. They are getting something that is more valuable by giving up something that is less valuable. So I would argue that trade is made possible not by equality of exchange, like Aristotle and Marx argued, but precisely the opposite, that it's the inequality that we see in items that causes us to want to trade. So that the person who has the shirt gives that shirt up to get a loaf of bread. And the person who has the loaf of bread gives that up to get a shirt. Both of them gave up something they wanted less to get something they wanted more. And both of them view that transaction as a net positive, meaning they both walk away feeling like that they have gotten something they wanted more instead of something they wanted less. And so that's inequality of exchange, not equality of exchange. So that's problematic for that labor theory of value. Okay, so does hard work matter? Well, it depends on the purposes for which you're doing it. And it also kind of depends on the recipient, how much they value hard work. Right? So labor theory of value is based on the labor hours and the input costs, like the materials, but even those input costs have behind them in the labor theory, they have human labor that produced them. Okay, so that would come out in the price. So it's you have time, X amount of time and materials. So like a haircut takes so much time, let's say 20 minutes of labor time plus materials, that would come out in the price. Okay. But how much is that labor time worth? I knew someone who didn't really work, didn't really want to pay rent, but wanted others to contribute to his living, and he didn't want to get a job, and wanted all kinds of kind of unreasonable things, and he characterized it as just wanting help. But whenever the idea of wanting a job, getting a job came up, he would say he wasn't going to work for anyone that didn't pay him at least $500 an hour, because he believed his labor was worth $500 an hour. And that's fine as far as it goes if he maybe really does have a skill that's worth $500 an hour. But you need that plus a buyer. So labor, the price can be set, but where's the buyer for it? Okay, so that's where I come back to, does hard work matter? For maybe a coach, they want to see a result, but they also want to see the hard work to get there. For them, hard work is part of the process. For the buyer of Pet Rock, no. The labor going into Pet Rock does not determine the price. The buyer does, right? And Stewie's art, we'll come back to that in a few minutes, but I have a Family Guy video of Stewie giving his art to his parents and how they react. So the labor theory of value has some pretty significant problems with it that I think are logically flawed and that don't allow it to be the explanation. Okay, Karl Marx is the one that kind of went the furthest with it, and he tried. He really did try, unlike others like Adam Smith, who just assumed the theory to be true. He tried to give an empirical basis for it, but it fell into question begging and circular reasoning and things that are demonstrably untrue. Now, others like Adam Smith and later on, more recently, the Chicago School would view that price comes from the input costs plus market demand equals the price. So like you're building a house, you have to factor in the materials that go into building a house, and that does come out in the price. So they're kind of right. But here's the thing. What is the original cost? I have here the turtle analogy. There's an ancient like Indian myth of the world sitting on top of the back of a turtle. But then a kid asked, okay, well, what does that turtle sit on the top of? Well, the back of another turtle. And then someone else, eventually somebody just said it's turtles all the way down to the bottom. Okay. But it's like, okay, but that's infinite regression, right? It's the same thing with the price of goods. That if you look back at every item that there is and you work back, okay, what was the original cost of the goods that made that? Okay, what were the original cost of the goods that went to make that? What were the original costs? You get back to goods in nature that don't have a price tag on them. They do have a cost. A cost is what you give up to get it. A price is what human beings place on it, which is on the basis of market demand. So materials don't have an original cost in the sense of having an original price. They do have a cost of you have to give up time, energy, and resources to make something. But like if you just find oil, there's no price tag on it. You just find it. Okay, so it doesn't have an original price. it's valuable because there's a market demand for it, and therefore that comes the supply and the demand create an equilibrium that comes out in the price. It's a scarce resource. People either want it or they don't. And if they want it, there's a certain amount of it, and that will lead to a higher or lower price. And so this is where you get to kind of some other economists, Mises, Hayek, the Austrian school, and you get to subjective value. This is coming about the later 1800s and the early 1900s that shifted the paradigm a little bit on this, that the value of something is determined by market demand, who actually wants it. And it's subjective. It's not on the basis of objective reality. It's determined on that different people can look at the same item and have different estimations of value based on whether or not they want it. So human demand determines value for the individual. Now, a lot of individuals may agree, and therefore that would cause the increased demand would cause an increased price. But there is no set objective economic value. And that's what we saw in the Everybody Loves Raymond episode with the Pokemon card, is that nothing changed in the labor of the card. And nothing changed in the cost of the materials to create the card. But what did change throughout the episode was the price. And the price changed because of the different values that people placed on the card. And once they realized other people valued it more and the price went up, that caused their value to change. And the core of the episode is where the little girl, the daughter, says why she wants the card. And she says it's her favorite and she loves it. And that's really what it's all about. That's the subjective value, is that there is no price without a buyer willing to pay the price. And so the aggregate of buyers, the demand, is what determines prices, therefore what determines value. And then it's on a subjective basis, meaning that there's no correct or incorrect valuation of things. It's simply on the basis of people want it for their own reasons or they do not. And their tastes may even change. And so I think subjective value, the theory of subjective value, can account for these things that previous economic thought and the labor theory of value cannot account for.